Rwanda in 1994, talk radio was a big part of leading to the conditions that created a genocide. The Hutu radio disc jockeys would call the Tutsis cockroaches. And there is the sense that these aren't human beings. You know, they're not human beings with children or grandchildren. These are cockroaches. And when you hear in talk radio that liberals are evil, that they are traitors, that they are godless, that they are on the side of the terrorists, that's hate language. You don't negotiate with evil people. You don't live in community with people you consider to be traitors.
Millions of Americans tune into right-wing talk radio every day. Rory O'Connor is a media critic and a liberal himself who's written a book on shock talkers. He says not all of these broadcasters use violent language, but they do all share a predilection for outrage. And he says they're all practically addicted to constantly cranking up that outrage.
Here's the real problem. When you shock somebody, if you come back the next time and you apply the same stimulus, it's not shocking any longer. It's already happened. So you have to ratchet it up a little bit. So how do you cut through? How do you really shock? And I think that in order to continue to outrage, you have to constantly be jacking up the pressure. And ultimately, there's going to be some deranged person out there in that audience who's going to say, you know what, that's a good idea, let me act on that.
The fusion of entertainment and enlightenment.
Entertainers. That's what a lot of the shock talkers call themselves. O'Connor says maybe, but their words can motivate their listeners to act.
Now, first and foremost, we have to recognize that many of them are employed across multiple platforms. So they may say something on their radio show, but they may repeat it on their television show. They may then repeat it in their newspaper column. They may repackage the ideas into their best-selling books.
Last year's debate over the immigration reform bill became a case study for Rory O'Connor. As arguments went back and forth, some of the language turned venomous. Hosts amped up their audience's outrage with attacks on the bill's supporters and verbal assaults on immigrants.
I already have received at least one brilliant email today about the immigration problem. This person sent me an email, said, when we defeat this illegal alien amnesty bill and when we yank out the welcome mat and they all start going back to Mexico, as a going-away gift, let's all give them a little box of nuclear waste. Tell them it'll heat tortillas.
But do you understand what the New York Times wants and the far left want? They want to break down the white Christian male power structure, of which you're a part, and so am I. And they want to bring in millions of foreign nationals to basically break down the structure that we have.
O'Connor says the result stunned Washington.
There were massive numbers of emails and letters and phone calls. You know, senators said they had to have 2 or 3 people in their office answering the calls. That was all that they could do. They were inundated. And beyond that, how do you get their attention? Well, I tell you, if you send a threatening letter to a senator's home, that gets his attention pretty fast.
Florida Republican Senator Mel Martinez got a threatening letter at home. North Carolina Republican Richard Burr got a threatening call at his office. South Carolina Republican Lindsey Graham told the New York Times that he and others had received threats too. The Times also reported that a mass email opposing the bill suggested that its supporters needed to be taken out by any means. The bipartisan support collapsed. The bill died. And right-wing talk radio hosts took credit.
This is evidence of their vast power. I mean, you know, President George Bush was pulling out all his political capital to get immigration reform passed. Trent Lott was backing him up with everything he had. And guess what? The president and the Republican leadership and Harry Reid and the Democratic leadership, they all lost. And they lost to a bunch of radio jocks.
Right-wing talk radio hosts usually reserve their ad hominem attacks for liberal figures. Jim Quinn has his own name for the National Organization for Women.
The National Organization for Whores. They're whores for liberal politics in general, and they were whores for Bill Clinton in particular.
Glenn Beck tried to connect former Vice President Al Gore's efforts against global warming with Nazism.
What was the first thing they did to get people to exterminate the Jews? Now, I'm not saying that anybody's going to, Al Gore's not going to be rounding up Jews and exterminating them. It is the same tactic, however. You got to have an enemy to fight. And when you have an enemy to fight, then you can unite the entire world behind you and you seize power. That was Hitler's plan. His enemy, the Jew. Al Gore's enemy, the UN's enemy, global warming.
During this year's Democratic primaries, Rush Limbaugh urged his listeners to vote for Senator Hillary Clinton to foster division in the Democratic Party, in the hope that that would lead to violence in the streets of Denver. He called it Operation Chaos.
This is about chaos. This is why it's called Operation Chaos. It's the dream end. I mean, if people say, what's your exit strategy? The dream end of this is that this keeps up to the convention. And that we have a replay of Chicago 1968 with burning cars, protests, fires, literal riots, and all of that. That's the objective here.
American politics has always been a rough game. But political scientist Jeffrey Feldman, who's written a book on the effects of angry political rhetoric, says this is different.
Our system is a deliberative democracy, and that deliberative democracy depends on a certain kind of talk, a certain conversation in order to function well. What right-wing rhetoric does when it reaches that violent pitch is it undermines that particular conversation such that the focus of political debate becomes increasingly hamstrung by fear, and the ability of citizens to engage in the basic act of civics becomes gummed up. That conversation breaks down.
Knoxville pastor Chris Bice agrees.
When you blame all your problems on some minority group, then everyone else is exonerated. We exonerate ourselves. We don't have to look at ourselves to see what sort of ways we contribute to the problems of the world. We don't have to examine ourselves to see what we're doing that is helping to create the problems that we're so concerned about.
In other words, Bice says, angry talk radio rhetoric simply sets up scapegoats for society's problems. And ever since Jim David Adkison walked into his church and opened fire, he can't help but wonder whether that might lead to more violence.
I just think a lot of people are hurling insults from the safety of television studios, the safety of radio studios, the safety of cyberspace, which they would not throw if they had to stand right next to a person and look in their face and say the same thing. And so that's a void in our community, the chance to be in the same room and to have these exchanges and remember the humanity of the person on the other side.
We may never know what finally triggered the killer's rage, unless he chooses at his trial or later to tell us. But not for a moment do I think that any of the talk show hosts mentioned by the police would have wished it to happen. We asked several radio hosts to come on this broadcast and talk about the story. They either declined or didn't return our calls. The issue, of course, is not their right to say anything they want on the air. The First Amendment guarantees their free speech, as it does mine. Government shouldn't be the arbiter of what the Bill of Rights leaves to one's own sense of fair play. Watching that report, however, I was reminded of a story from folklore about the tribal elder telling his grandson about the battle the old man was waging within himself. He said, "My son, it is between two wolves. One is an evil wolf, anger, envy, sorrow, greed, self-pity, guilt, resentment, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is the good wolf, joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The boy took this in for a few minutes and then asked, "Which wolf won?" His grandfather answered, "The one I feed."